Welcome back to the shop, everybody. Allison and I are going to be kind of going over a couple, how should we say, exciting-ish things with the H-Series motor. So she's behind the camera.
Hi, everyone.
Obviously, I'm in front of the camera.
Yep.
So the point of this video is to primarily go over the H-Series motor, primarily the bottom end. We are going to briefly touch maybe a few points on the top end, but primarily what rod ratio and or displacement makes the most sense for you and your build. Now, we get this asked frequently, you know, what rods, what pistons, what combination could I use? I want to be a little bit more frugal and maybe be a little bit of a cheap ass and not buy forged components, or, you know, what can I get away with? What kind of power goals can I get with certain aspects? And the real question is what kind of driving profile can I get with those different rod ratios?
It's not cookie cutter at all.
Yeah, and there is no one right answer. So we kind of want to help you guys kind of pick which of these options makes the most sense and kind of go over everything. So we actually earlier today took a H-Series motor, which mind you,
it's a weird idea we've had for a very long time.
Very weird idea. But the thing that's funny about it is we took an H-Series motor. This was a B205/B235 block. So I actually cut the end of the block off. So as you can see, the end of the block is gone. And we kind of wanted to show you guys what different profiles and displacements and rod ratios you can get with different rods from different H-Series motors. When we were cutting this apart, it was a little bit of a pain in the butt, but really not that bad. I went ahead and just essentially made it so you could see this last piston here. The other three pistons, there's nothing in there. That's just the crank. And now we're gonna start with a couple different crank options, go over each individual rod option, talk about some different size pistons, the stock pistons, and then some built options, and kind of go over all those things. Now, the thing that's the most important about this video, and primarily what we're gonna be discussing, is what the best rod ratio / displacement is, arguably. And then we're gonna kind of talk about some of the limitations of what each individual rod ratio or piston setup you can run into, whether that be hybrid motors, fully custom motors, or just kind of part spin, forged rods and piston combos.
We're gonna help you find the perfect setup for your 3.5 cylinder H-Series motor.
Yes, the 3.5 is my favorite by far. So the B230 nothing. This is primarily going to be relevant pretty much if you go all the way back to the H-Series birth, more or less the B202. You could argue that they all have the same bore size. So they're all going to be running standard. Now we're just talking from a stock standpoint. So the 90 millimeter is what they are all going to be running. Now there is one exception, which is the 2.1 NA C900. Did run a 93 millimeter piston, which is going to come into conversation later on with why that's relevant. It's actually very relevant, especially if you want to get some of those larger displacement motors. Yeah. So the way we have it set up right now, as you can see in here, we actually have a 2-3 crank. This piston I have sitting in here.
Say that one's just not.
Well, I left it
not doing
purposely
anything.
Taken out.
You sure about that?
I'm gonna go ahead and pop this out. Now we actually have 4 pistons, 4 rods, and 2 cranks. Each crank that we have sitting here come from an H-Series motor. And what's important to say here is whether it is a 2-liter crank from a B205 or 2-liter crank from a B204, they're the same throw. Now the B235R crank that is in here is gonna be the same throw and the same crank that is the B234i or turbo, or B235R, and then if you want to get really crazy, the B236 or in China, the other weird variations.
Needless to say, there's a lot of cars you can snag the crank.
So the 2.3 crank is a 2.3 crank regardless of what motor you pull it from. Same with the 2.0 crank is the same regardless of what one you pull it from. And we're primarily talking, once again, from like 1993 up. So we're not going to be doing anything with the B202 rods, all those other options with the rods. It is a little different, but we're primarily going to be talking from the 9000, the 900, NG 900 that is, OG 93, 95. So primarily T7 and T5 cars. Now with the rods and pistons, we do actually have a couple different sets here. I have a set of B234. These were forged. We have our set of B204. We have our set of B205.
Look at that.
And then we also have our B235.
B205 Rod, look at it. Just side by side. It really is crazy how crap those rods are.
So as you can notice here too, we have two rods that are identical, or more or less look identical.
Practically.
And there's a reason why they are identical. So they have the same length, which is 153 millimeters. But the forged crack rod is gonna look just
almost like a puzzle.
It's gonna look just like this.
Yep.
The B205 rods also are.
It's cracked, broken.
It's cracked, broken. That's a F1 technology there, so I've started utilizing. Now, the thing that's funny is we actually see more spun bearings on the forged crack than we do actually on the older pre-forged crack. We have right here, as you can see, this Haas of a meat piston. This is a forged billet piston from a B234R. This is a standard stock B204. You can see from the factory, this is a Haas of a piston. We have a B205.
Womp womp.
Not very good, let's just be honest. This isn't forged, it's stock, trash.
Look at that size difference. That's the craziest thing in the world.
Yeah, so both 2-liter motors, wrist pistons in different locations. That then brings us to the pathetic B235R piston, which are prone for just blowing up. That's what they do. So these crack and just blow up because that's what they do. So as we can kind of see the random assortment of pistons and rods, we're gonna go into depth about those rod ratios. What are the benefits, the disadvantages? So we'll go over the pros and cons with each stock setup, and then we'll kind of go over some other setups as well. So we're gonna go ahead and get the B234R piston and rod set up in here so you can kind of see how that works and how that sits in there.
Cody's getting the demonstration set up for you guys.
Yeah, and as I mentioned earlier, all of these arguably, once again, they all have the same bore size. Now, there are oversized pistons that can be utilized, so bore overs or first over, as you would call it. So if you're running like a 90.5, but everything we're talking about is more or less going to be the stock 90 bore size.
Pretty much every car that is built by us that leaves the shop,
it's usually a 90.5. Yeah, anymore, there's
the mileage.
Cross-hatching's always gone.
Yes, cross-hatching is always
at this point. If you're at if you're at the point of over 100,000 miles, and we see this all the time, we'll have people say, "Oh, my cross-hatching's good enough," and I'll just be honest. Usually it's not. So 100,000 miles, if you're 100 or more, just go next size over. Because even if you rehone the motor, you're going to be removing material, and when you put a new set of 90s in there, 90 millimeters or 89.9, you're going to be getting a little bit more slop. Now you can obviously take some of that slop up if you gap the rings a little bit more aggressively, but at the end of the day, just do a bore over and you have a perfectly honed and
you're gonna pay the same, what, $20 more for a set of pistons, but ready for this? $300 to $500 to literally make your car last longer because you're getting a fresh
it's all fresh surfaces.
Yes.
So people just do not be a cheap ass unless you are literally just trying to throw it together just to get it back on the road. It's just not worth it. So spend the extra $300, and in some cases $225. Just do the bore over. If your car's under 100,000 miles, I would argue, okay, there are some scenarios where it does make sense. So I went ahead and set this up here for the B234, just to kind of show you guys. And everything's just kind of hand tight. I'm not gonna sit here and lie to you and tell you it's not everything.
Nah.
Damn it.
Could just said if I had a power tool, it'd be way quicker. Like we don't have what, a whole toolbox full of said power tools. That's a lot easier, isn't it? Haas.
Now, as you guys know, the block obviously is not being utilized, nor are any of the other components in this demonstration.
I'm gonna run it.
We're gonna put it at bottom, dead center here. Now, before we go into each setup, a couple pointers or a couple things to kind of maybe educate some of you guys on, kind of have an understanding. The lower the rod ratio, which we're gonna be starting with the lowest rod ratio possible, the lower rod ratios typically are gonna be better for low end torque, better throttle response, where the higher rod ratios are arguably going to be better for revving out, top end. Another reason, typically like F1 cars, things like that, the reason why you really want to get to a longer rod ratio or higher rod ratio is it actually produces less heat. So it runs cooler, which is crucial, especially if you have thin walls on some motors. And then most importantly, the load wall friction. So what that means is, you know, a lower load wall friction, or however you want to say it, less friction. The angle of which the rod itself is going up and down in that cylinder, more or less is less of an aggressive angle, right? So the littler of the angle, as you would say, or the less aggressive of an angle is gonna have less load and create less friction, thus running much cooler. So yes, you're not gonna have as a responsive motor or throttle response with the higher rod ratio, and with that lower, you're gonna have much better. The shorter the rod ratio is gonna be much better for low end torque, better throttle response. So now the longer the rod is gonna gonna be way better for higher revving. It's gonna run cooler. You're gonna have to essentially rev that motor out to make your power, which in our opinion makes way more sense on an H-Series motor, because at the end of the day, they all came front-wheel drive from the factory. Not only did the T7 cars and arguably the T5 cars actually limited the amount of boost you would make, where the T7 cars limited the amount of torque and horsepower you made in first and second gear. So we go in and we start tuning these cars, and people are like, oh, I just want to have all the instantaneous spool. It's like, but why? So you're just going to spin your tires. Well, then I'm not going to make that much horsepower. Okay, well then at that point, just leave the car stock. If you are looking at getting the best rod ratio and you want that low and grunt, you know, LSD is really important, and some of those other components to make sure you actually get the power down. This motor arguably is, you know, or I should say this setup, this rod ratio with the 147 millimeter rod length, that is what was originally in the B234. That is the shortest rod length option. So that means our rod ratio on this is just over 1.6. So it's like 1.63. The 1.63 rod ratio, something that I find comical is people will talk about, you know, utilizing these motors, and some people put them in drift cars, put them in other various applications. This is not a good motor. So the B234R is a horrible motor for revving out. So 7,000 is usually the cap. Now, mind you, there's gonna be someone out there who's revved one to 8,000, this, that, whatever. Yes, okay, maybe, that's possible, sure. But typical rule of thumb, if your rod ratio is under 1.7, you're not really gonna be revving that past 7,000 RPM. Now, there are some variations and different other factors to think about, but with this having a 1.63, 6,800 is usually the max. That's where we typically stop when we are tuning these. 66, 6,800, 7,000, not so much. Tends to not enjoy it that much. Now, there are arguments you can take it over 7,000 with other basic modifications, but this motor, you can run it to 700 horsepower. The B234R on the stock rods and pistons, you can get 600 horsepower. Now, that's not going to be indefinite. It is going to run into failure at some component point is going to fail. But there have been plenty of people, especially in Sweden, plenty of people that are running the B234R well past 500 wheel horsepower. Now, what I will tell you about the rod ratio in this particular motor, when I am driving it, I do agree. When I'm driving a 9,000, let's just say stock for stock.
Oh, they're so fun. It's got
a good punch to it.
Yes.
Now, if you ever get the opportunity to ride in or drive a 9,000 with a proper final drive as well, and with this rod ratio, and you just kind of maybe do a light tune on it, downpipe.
Perfect city car.
Yeah, it's literally such a blast. But anything past than that, it's not the go-to. So as you can see, we'll go ahead and rotate it here. When we go to top dead center, our piston is perfectly flush. I mean, it's barely down. You're getting a really deep dish on this piston, so your actual compression ratio is a little different, a little lower compared to some of the other H-Series motors. That T5 gasket is substantially thicker over like a T7 gasket. Something to take into consideration if you are trying to run this piston and utilize this bottom end on a T7 car, you end up having to actually machine some of this off. I do not recommend doing that. Do not machine a stock piston.
We've actually seen multiple
So many people, especially over in Europe, just to save some money, they'll actually machine off material off the top of these pistons. And yeah, they'll still be arguably just as strong, but just buy a proper piston. At that point, you're saving yourself a few $100s, and you're not technically still on a proper billet forged piston or in rod setup. What I would tell you as we get away from this setup is this is solely the setup to go with, in my opinion, if you are arguably just trying to stay under 400 brake horsepower, you just want to have low and grunt, and leave it at that.
Yeah, if you want to just toss a reliable bottom end into your Vigan or something, you know, it's not a bad idea by any means.
Correct. And something else also that a lot of people aren't aware of, on the 9000, there's actually a cutaway, which is on the backside of the piston right here. It's actually supposed to be over here. There's actual cutaway on that piston, which is essentially the oil squirter cutaway and whatnot. So if you are going to utilize this piston and try to put it in another block, be conscious of the oil squirters. Piston swap. So we're going to keep the 2.3 crank, which is the 90 millimeter throw. Now, something that I guess a lot of people may know is in other motors and industry, 2JZ, for example, is a squared motor as well. What a squared motor is essentially when your
stroke and bore are
the
same.
It's essentially the same. So a squared motor, meaning this is a 90 on a 90. This is technically a squared motor. And squared motors tend to do better, arguably.
This is Cody's representation. of long versus short rod.
Yeah, I guess.
Sir, that is not a hammer.
It's a, well, it is now because it's going to go in the trash. As we mentioned earlier, if you are trying to skimp out, I guess, and not buy forged rods, a lot of people will run the B204 rods over the B235 R rods. As we mentioned, there are slight variations, differences over the years. So some people would argue the B204 are a little beefier, a little bit more grammage, as I would call it, a little bit more weight to them. But I would tell you just get forged rods. Now, there are plenty of things online. Plenty of people will say the B235 and or the B204 rods, they'll take, you know, 600 brake horsepower. Yeah, there's plenty of people that have done it, but I've also seen them fail at 350, 400 brake horsepower.
Yep.
The thing that's really important to think about why rods typically bend, it's usually back pressure. So clogged cats, too much knock, you're tuning and you're not properly dialing it in. You get that knock, that's essentially what ends up bending these rods.
Seen plenty of clogged cats bending rods.
Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and put one of the 153 millimeter rods, which is found both in the B204 and the B235. Now we have the B235R piston and rod in there. With this setup, you do get a rod ratio of about 1.7, which is about 0.07 more than a 9000, which is really where you want to be, especially if you want to rev between that 7 and 8,000 RPM range. Now,
great for a nicely built daily.
Yeah, and I would argue you don't get that low end grunt as early, especially when you do end up utilizing like T5 cams, things like that in the head. Moving that power band up is really where you want to go, and that's what this starts to do. And when you are effectively building out a B235R or utilizing this rod piston combo, something to take into consideration is this will allow you to make arguably substantially more power on the top end. So it's like, why wouldn't you kind of go this route versus the B234R route solely for the fact that you're moving the power band up in all aspects. It really does allow you to make more horsepower that's usable. Now, typical rule of thumb, rod ratios that fall in between 1.6 and 1.7, typically you can see that 7 to 8,000 window. The closer you are down to like that 1.6 rod ratio, that gets you closer to that 6,000. 1.7 gets you closer to that 8,000. So typically as your rod ratio increases, as we'll get to that point. Now, something to take into consideration is with the B235Rs in particular, we all know the pistons are glass. We've seen
pistons.
Yeah, we've seen stock pistons fail on stock tunes, just a slight elevation change.
Yes, a boost leak.
A boost leak, you can say goodbye. Car can't pull it more than 20 degrees of timing and it just blows up.
And then blows up. Yep.
So this is the weak point. The only reason why the B234 and the B204 are better is because you have those beefier pistons.
They're Haas, yes.
Once you take this piston out, put a forged piston in, you have a substantially better motor. Now, I would argue, if you really want to get specific here, the ultimate motor build, you would start with the B206 block, not the B204, not the B234.
The real ones know.
So the OGs or anyone that really knows about building these H-Series motors, you know the B206 is literally the block you want to go with. Obviously, then source out the rods and the pistons for something else. Now, when utilizing this setup, the 90 mil crank, there's something else we want to bring up. We briefly brought it up earlier on, and that is utilizing a oversized piston. So when we go to the first bore over, which is 0.5, so like a 90.5 piston, sometimes you have really bad scoring, you gotta go to a 91 millimeter piston. Literally, you're changing the displacement at that point, which is a good thing.
Replacement for displacement.
So if in fact you do want to run a forged rod, a forged piston, and then bore it over, you can get that 2.4 or 2.5 displacement that a lot of people talk about. Running that larger displacement means you're gonna get torque earlier on, kind of, once again, kind of defeats the point with having that lower rod ratio. So on a B234, I would tell you, don't go to a 2.4, don't go to a 2.5, doesn't make sense. However, if you are gonna be running a slightly higher rod ratio with that 1.7, going to a slightly larger piston such as a 92 or 93 makes a lot of sense, because then you run that 2.4, 2.5, throw an LC in a transmission, you can get that natural occurring torque, and it doesn't cost a massive amount of money to put a big turbo on it. You can essentially get away with maybe a 19T or a 15T that you've got fully maxed out, and then make that torque from that larger displacement. So the only downside, and this kind of applies across the board with going past 92 millimeter, once you get to the 93, and that's really the max you can go. There are some people, especially if you go jump on like UK Saab's form from back in the day, there are definitely some cases where people are running, especially in the C900s, running a 94 millimeter setup, which tends to become maybe a little problematic, primarily with the head and the way the head sits. So when you run a 93 millimeter piston, the one downside right off the rip is if you need to ever rebuild or bore that motor again, you can't. There's no more material left. So another motor, which, okay, whatever, these motors cost nothing nowadays. 2, if you run a 93 millimeter piston, you're pretty much forced to O-ring the block or run a solid copper head gasket or something that's an upgraded gasket nonetheless. But what we have found that works the best is O-ringing the block and running a solid copper gasket. And then the last thing, when you run a 93 millimeter piston, it's actually beneficial, but it fully unshrouds the valves. So you're actually gonna get better airflow and actually get a better detonation going to that larger displacement solely because you fully unshroud the valves once you actually bore out to 93. So would I tell you to run a 93 millimeter piston? I'm gonna go for that 2.5. No, I would say actually 92 is kind of the sweet spot. 91, 92, you are gonna increase the displacement. Running the 2.4, in my opinion, makes more sense than the 2.5 just from the other aspects. You are keeping a little bit more material on the sidewall. You're not forced to do the O-ringing, which I would still recommend doing anyways. It doesn't force you to make a custom gasket either. You can actually buy a 92 right off the shelf versus a 93, you cannot. So that's all gonna be custom. So we're gonna go ahead and remove this, go to the 2-liter crank, and then talk about the 2-liter pistons, and then kind of some displacement options and kind of how we can build those out to be kind of a cool, unique build as too. Something else to take into consideration, when we get past that 1.7 rod ratio, pretty much on the T5 and the T7 cars, the B235R, you are going to out-rev the head before you out-rev this rod ratio. So if you are effectively not rebuilding the head and you're keeping this rod ratio, the bottom end is going to be fine. You're not gonna out-rev it from the rod ratio standpoint.
Or take advantage of it, upgrade valve springs.
Yeah, so at that point, if you are trying to go past the 7 to 8,000, we recommend once you go to 772, you really should go to upgraded valve springs. Now, when we put upgraded valve springs in any of our customers' cars, whether it be a 19T or whatever, we pretty much just tell them just do it because we have actually seen valve flow, especially on the intake side, even on 6800, especially if you're money shifting or sometimes if you're just aggressively driving the car.
If you're already rebuilding the head and putting new valves in, you might as well. It's what, $400 for a set of upgraded valve
springs? Yeah, so
springs?
depending on which upgraded valve springs you go with and how you do it. So we sell some in-house and then some other various tuners and people sell them as well. Once you are already in there, you should replace the springs.
Money that is worth putting in the
it's
car.
just do it. Because if you just happen to be out there redlining it and you happen to maybe do a money shift or something, it is just an extra form of safety. We actually had a customer locally who over-revved his motor and actually
won the race.
Valves. Yeah.
That's what matters.
Won the race, but floated his valves and spun his balance shaft, which we told him to do a balance shaft delete. So spun the balance shaft bearing and floated valves, both of which things should be done if you're planning on making anything over that 400 brake horsepower, in my opinion. Okay, so as we get ready to put the 2-liter crank, or what we really call it, the 78 millimeter crank, and versus the 90 millimeter crank, because that is the throw. There is something you can do if you find yourself, maybe you have multiple Saab motors, you get them mixed up, you're at the junkyard.
People ask us this question.
And if you look,
easiest way to tell?
There's a 78 right here. And
there you go.
On the 2.3, there's a 90. So it's very easy to identify which is which. Now, we also get asked, how much power can the stock crank make? Well, there have been plenty of people who have made well over 700 wheel. There have been plenty of people who have made
over 700 wheel on stock bottom ends.
100% stock bottom ends. So, I don't think anyone's truly looked at what they fail at, but I would tell you somewhere probably between 900 and 1,000. So buying a forged crank, it's something that
it is cool. Like
it is better from a balance standpoint. A to Z, the one they sell, we sell the same one. So if you're somebody that's interested wanting to run a forged crank, that's something we can do for you. If you look at running a forged crank for hell, even like the B284s and stuff like that. So there's a lot of forged crank options. On some motors it makes more sense than other motors. I'm gonna go ahead and set up the 2-liter crank and whatnot, and then kind of show you some of that. Kind of go over each of the 2-liter rod ratios, kind of what kind of powers and RPM you can see on those. Talk a little bit about the heads and kind of some of those other options and things you kind of need to take into consideration if you're planning on revving the motor past that 7,000 mark. B204, arguably the GOAT.
The
So
GOAT, greatest of all time.
everybody would agree the B204. The reason why I would argue that is, in my honest opinion, once again, in the top 3 best motors ever made. You have a motor that from the factory takes all kinds of abuse, throw it into an S15 for a drift car, BMW 3 Series,
Goated.
Caterham, Miata. It's been put in everything. Now, everyone in Europe, that is. In the United States, not so much. Anyone that, you know, is on Facebook, you're part of the Saab group. A lot of people put them in Astras, everything else.
So cool.
But the reason why is for the money. There is not a cheaper motor, I don't care what anyone says, that is a 4-cylinder, and I'd even argue 6-cylinder, that you're gonna get this kind of power other than Mitsubishi 4G63.
But back to the money thing.
Goes back to money. You cannot get those cheap. From displacement size, there is not a better motor, in my opinion, that you're gonna get this kind of horsepower out of a 2-liter. If there is, please put in the comments below what motor that you think that is a 2-liter or less. The rod ratio on this thing, which is what makes it crazy, it is just shy of 2.0. At 1.96, that makes this a screamer. So yes, you're revving this over 8,000 RPM. Arguably, you're revving this over 9,000 RPM. You can take this motor well past the limits of the head, all aspects. When you are essentially building a B204 versus a B235 or B234, these tend to be ready to go and be dropped in anything. The thing that's nicer too is the way that the block is set up. It's better for like rear wheel drive setups and things like that.
Yes,
so I would argue, for the money, the B204, they're way easier to find. 9,000s, particularly in the United States, are non-existent in the junkyards now. You can still find B204s relatively easy. Something else to take into consideration about the B204 as a whole, rod ratio, all that fun stuff. When you do run upgraded piston and rod, if you decide to do the forged rod and pistons, there is some benefit sometimes because you can actually bounce a rotating assembly, get a little weight off of there. So there is some advantage of doing that as well. But something that is to take into consideration too, the compression ratio on this setup is a little bit different compared to B234, B235, B205 as well. So depending if you're trying to throw copious amounts of boost at something versus not, you can also see here, the piston is pretty much flush with the block on the B204s. So you have less volume in there. When you run that T5 gasket, you know, you have that essentially being compensated on that gasket. But if you are going to run a T7 head on a B204, that goes back to that point that you need to run that T5 gasket to make up for that. If not, you're gonna be machining a portion of the piston off. Which
just run the gasket.
Just don't. Just run the proper gasket down at the end. The thing that's also nice, if you are running a T7 head and you are planning on making, you know, over the 500 brake horsepower, I would say 500 to 600 brake horsepower, you are going to be utilizing T7 head. If you're trying to flow a little bit more air, the CFM is only about 5 more CFM. It's really not a lot more in the difference between the T5 versus the T7 head.
And ideally, couldn't you just run a Cometic gasket too?
Yeah, and Cometic also offers the right, and we sell Cometic gaskets that are actually the same thickness as the T5 gaskets. You can actually get different sizes.
And their race application.
And the race application is nice. Layer. And then triple layer, as Allison just said, but also O-ringing the block. You kind of save your components by doing that. Now, as we're getting to that closer to 2.0 or over 2.0 here shortly on this next setup, you are going to take into consideration that there are other components that you need to start taking into consideration when you start to rev. You're also going to start looking at the oil pump is not going to do adequate amount of oil, or I should say oiling, I guess is what you would say, not proper lubrication. So your oil pressure is going to start to become an issue. Also, your alternator is going to start to become an issue. AC, all those other components that start to become an issue once you get past that 8,000 mark. So not only are you going to be upgrading the head, everything else. So what we typically do once we're building a motor or car to go past 8,000, typically we're deleting the power steering. Yeah, the power steering accessory is getting deleted. The AC is getting deleted. Pulley has to be updated. Now, if you are deleting the AC, that does give you a perfect location to actually do a dry sump setup. So with the 2-liter setup, if you are planning on doing a budget build, so this is where we're gonna go on the budget build side of things, find yourself a B204, throw that in. Stay away from the B234 unless you're wanting to stay in at 400.
For a used motor swap, B204.
Yeah, used motor swap all day. And even if you're trying to do another car, you want another car to have a completely different setup in it, B204 is gonna be your budget.
They're so bulletproof. Even Ryan, one of our team members, his personal daily has a T5 bottom end, and
T7 head.
Yep, T7 head, and it's always fucked and it's always running.
So, and just on that note, if you want to run a full T5 motor, very easy to do. Literally all you're going to be doing is essentially cutting the stock manifold. You can actually cut it off, or the T5 portion of it off, which is the part that bolts to the head. There's a coolant sensor and some things there. And then just essentially weld on the T7 portion of the manifold on, and then you can just run the whole B204. And it costs literally just, if you don't know how to weld, it costs someone a couple hours of welding to weld that on, and you can essentially just straight up run a B204 in your T7 car. If you're truly going for a budget build. I'm gonna go ahead and rotate this over, just kind of show you. And the thing that's really crazy is how thick the B204 pistons are. Rotation wise, you can kind of see, everything's gonna look very similar, but you can see that location of that wrist pin is actually in a completely different location, thus allowing for the same length rod that the B235 and the B204 share. Wrist location difference is what allows this to happen. Which brings us to the last motor / rod ratio, the B205. Now, B205 in the United States was only offered in the OG 9.3. In Europe and everywhere else, it was also offered in the 9.5. Biopower, as everyone knows as well. So we didn't get that in the States. What I will tell you is,
we never get anything for it.
Well, and I'll be honest, I wish we would have gotten the Biopower in the States. I think it just would have been kind of cool, but you can obviously run Biopower. There's obviously plenty of ways to tune them, utilizing the European files, things like that. But something that is really cool about the B205, minus from factory stock, it's absolutely trash. The bullshit exhaust camshaft, horrible
B205,
lift.
here at the shop we call it B205 loser.
Yeah, we call it B205 loser in the stock form.
Yes.
Pistons are arguably just as bad as B235R. They do like to crack and detonate. However, the rod ratio in this is a very impressive 2.04. That is crazy. Amazing. In some applications, done right, you can actually rev a motor that's over 2.0. That's a 14,000 RPM motor. I'm not saying that this will do 14,000 RPM by any means, but what I will tell you is getting upwards to the 11 to 12,000, it's very realistic. So the highest I've ever actually revved an H-Series motor as a whole is right around 9,000. Now this setup, we have actually not taken over 9,000 or 10,000 or experimented on this yet. So we're actually going to be running, how should I say?
Well, this setup will be on your Laser Red Vigan, right?
Yeah, so the Laser Red Vigan build, which you guys will see what's going on later on.
Put this setup in his
and Ryan's actually going to be doing something very similar too. We're going to be utilizing the B205 rod and then a custom 92 millimeter piston, which more or less is going to end up giving us like a 2.1 displacement. Running this setup in a front wheel drive car that's making copious amounts of power just makes sense. B204 obviously all day, 9,000. Why not take one of these to 10 or 11,000 RPM?
Why not?
Why not? You're gonna need a massive turbo. You're gonna need some crazy cams if you're keeping it front wheel drive.
And all the accessories to accompany these high RPMs as well.
So it's one of those things that we're kind of looking forward to, kind of doing a little R&D on later on, a year or so from now. That's kind of what's looking like. I think Ryan will probably have his Vigan back together at some point this year. So pretty sure that's what he's gonna be doing, but not 100% sure on that by any means. But that is the plan for one of the cars here at the shop to be running a 2.1. So if you're going to be revving them out and getting that crazy 2.04 rod ratio, these need to be forged. Pistons, same thing, they need to be forged. So running both of these forged is a must. I would tell you, if you're going to be, essentially going from that standpoint, you're going to need some type of a duration of a camshaft that's going to be over 268. I would tell you lift well over 9. That is going to be what it's going to take if you truly want to take advantage of that higher RPM. Now, you don't have to necessarily go for super high revving. You can build these out, even stock, in the stock form. We'll run these over 300 horsepower all day. 15T, stock.
Really the biggest thing is just going to T5 cams.
Yeah, the cams is huge.
Best way to make your car safer.
Yeah, so going to T5 cams. Now, arguably, the T5 heads are a little bit more resilient, solely for the fact that the valve stems are 7 millimeter thick.
Oh, they're Haas.
Compared to the T7, they're 5 millimeter thick. So the main reason T7 heads actually flow better is because of the size of the valves. It's not really so much the head itself. Like I said, it's literally like 5 CFM difference between the two. So it's really not a big difference. When you start to go and import some of that material out and try to, cram more and more air into these motors, it really doesn't matter which head, if it's a T5 or T7. So I would argue T7 heads at this point are easier to find and they're a little cheaper, I would say, here in the States in particular. One of these are fully forged. Whether you keep it as a 2 liter or go to a 2.1, you're gonna make copious amounts of power on the top end compared to something like a B234. Now, if we were to pick any one particular setup, if I were someone that's looking to be over 400, I would go with the B235R, forged rod, forged piston. Once you get over the 600 brake, that's when I would start to make that transition to a 2-liter. So that 600 brake, 650, 700, I would start to look at making my power on the top end on a front wheel drive car. If you are essentially modifying the car that isn't, doesn't come with a Saab motor, didn't come with, and you're using it for a rear-wheel drive or using all-wheel drive, or similar to the all-wheel drive Vigan that we've been working on.
A better platform than the car that it came out of.
So the F25, F40 is a good application for higher revving for sure, especially when you do straight cut gears. Hell, even F28. So if you are setting it up for high revving, it makes sense because you're gonna be able to put the traction down. But I'll be honest with you, once you pass the 550 wheel mark in a front wheel drive car,
you get sketch.
It's just, you're not planting the power. It gets hard. So you're not gonna have first gear, you're not gonna have second gear. You can make it plant if you have a transmission that can take the abuse.
A transmission.
So whether it be VAG application or it be a fully built F40, if you do go for front wheel drive and you're actually able to plant it, you have a super wide tire, you're gonna wanna utilize like the Turbo X drive, final drive, in the F40. Something along those lines is gonna give you a better final drive, which again, another video for another day. But back to the main point of what we're getting at is, if you are trying to make the most amount of power, make it on the top end. Don't make it sooner, and don't build. And that's like, even we had a customer actually just leave a couple of months ago. He's got a 99 OG93.
Oh, Will's yeah.
Not a Vigan, but it's OG93 it's a gorgeous
really
car.
Nice build.
Cool build. He's still kind of doing some stuff. So we gotta get wider tires on. But he actually has a top mount GTX 30 on his car that we set up. He's got an F40 as well. But the thing that's funny is we actually went with the rod ratio from the B235R. So his car is actually running B235R pistons that are forged and rods that are forged. So it actually has that slightly better rod ratio, solely because it's a daily driver still. So instead of staying with that 2-liter displacement, we did go 2.3. So it gives it more in-town torque.
He wanted more, a little bit of grunt.
Yeah, so he's not trying to max out the motor by any means. So, 400, 450 wheels is kind of where he'd like to be, which is kind of the sweet spot of the B235R, because you're still able to plant the power down if you have the right tires.
I think it's the most fun.
Yeah, most fun. I think arguably if I had to pick the sweet spot in keeping the car front wheel drive on a stock transmission, mind you, maybe throw an LSD in it, but just the F25, F35, 400 brake, 450 brake, somewhere in there.
19T, E85.
19T, 20G, something along those lines on E85, making that 400 brake, 400 wheel roughly right around that window. It's kind of the sweet spot for reliability, fun, and you're just not, killing it. But at the same time, it is super fun when you pop your hood and you've got a massive GTX 30 or GTX 35 right there. And it is kind of fun trying to keep the thing going straight in front wheel drive cars. So now, commonly found on multiple forums online, you'll see different debates on which piston, which motor, which this, which that makes the most sense. Now, what I will tell you is this is the one that does not make any sense. So you will commonly find people trying to utilize the B204 piston with the B234 rod for some reason. Problem with this is you do lose about 6 millimeters. So if you're still utilizing a T5 head, your compression is gonna be absolutely screwed. Now, yeah, arguably if you threw a T7 gasket on this, it would run. The compression ratio just does get a little wonky due to the fact that this piston essentially sits 6 millimeters different compared to the B234. Now, before we go into the other compression ratios for the H-Series motors, something I just want to clarify real quick, just if anyone gets confused. Sometimes we get confusion when people ask this about the rod length versus piston and throw. Your displacement is solely based off of the throw of the crank and the size of your piston, meaning how large your actual cylinder is. So the length of the rod will not affect your displacement. Now, compression can be directly affected by the design of the piston and can be affected by the thickness of a gasket and then the actual length of the rod. So going into the earlier 9000 long block B234 R or L, they're gonna have actually the worst compression ratio in my opinion. Now maybe it was high for the time, but it's only an 8.5 compression ratio. And general rule of thumb, if we want to push that car past that 20 PSI, sure, that may work and that may be perfectly fine. But when we're trying to make bigger power, it doesn't necessarily make sense. So getting away from a block and a design that really isn't being utilized really in anyone's builds, going to something like a B204S, which really isn't that common. It does have a slightly larger compression ratio at 8.8, which is kind of getting us in the territory we want to get to. Now, when you find a B204 R, L, doesn't matter which it is, they're all going to have a 9.2 compression ratio. That gets you kind of right where you start you know, to get past that 9, when you start to throw more power, that's kind of where you want to be. Now, once you get close to that 9.5, as I said earlier, or that 10, yeah, you do want to start looking at E85 as an option, which is perfect. Running a 10-to-1 ratio with E85 is honestly, in my opinion, like the way to go. As you get away and you go to like the B234R, found in the later 9000s, that's actually going to have a 9.25 compression ratio. Once again, we are increasing that slightly. And then going to the T7 cars, you're going to utilize like the B235, as I mentioned earlier, 9.3, and then or like the B205, which actually has a relatively low 8.8. So if you are planning on, you know, throwing copious amounts of boost, as I've kind of said, maybe making like a 2-1 with that B205 rod and piston, it does make a lot of sense utilizing that slightly lower compression ratio found in the B205 at 8.8. Thus, also when we build our B235R blocks, or, you know, for higher power, we do like to use that thicker gasket and slightly lower it down. So utilizing a stock T7 gasket, it's about 0.03 thickness, where the T5 is 0.06. You can even go slightly thicker, especially depending on what kind of boost we're planning on throwing at the motor, and go as far as a 0.086 thickness on that gasket. And that will also affect compression ratio. So by utilizing a thicker T5 gasket, we're actually lowering that compression ratio to help throw more boost at it. So if we were gonna run a similar setup, if we wanted to run, let's say a T7 head, or do some type of weird other combination of different parts and use, let's say, a T7 gasket, that would potentially, but what we would need to do if we were going to run a B235 rod and piston. But because we were wanting to lower that compression ratio from that 9.3 to a little lower to help throw more boost at it, that's typically what we would do. Now, something else to take into consideration as well, when you are running and utilizing some of the other components, such as camshafts from various different motors, things like that, something we actually like to do, especially in high horsepower builds, we actually like to utilize a T5 gasket on our B235R or B205 builds. Solely A, it does lower the compression, but the other thing that helps a lot is if you are utilizing T5 cams or NA cams, it actually makes lining them up that much easier. It's almost drop-in at that point without having to finagle with some things. Because it can get a little tricky sometimes when you are putting the NA cams or the B202 cams into a T7 car. So something that also makes sense to kind of show you the difference between pistons. We showed you kind of on the side, but at the end of the day, the easiest way to identify if you're unsure, the 9000s have a very deep dish, as you can see here, which also is why their compression ratio is a little different from the other motors. B204 actually has the cutouts, which is absolutely cool.
So cool.
They should have all came like this. Don't understand why Saab didn't do that. B205, it literally just has this little tiny divot in the center, and then a B235 literally just
one's really crusty.
has a little bit of a dip, but it's not, you know, as aggressive as the B234. So a couple other pointers or things that just to bring up when modifying these cars, it's kind of should be common knowledge at this point. Delete the balance shafts. Just delete the balance shafts, get rid of the balance shafts.
Get rid of those balance shafts.
There is a reason why the
them.
B206 existed, which is essentially just a B204 without balance shafts from the factory. You don't need them. Now, you are going to arguably notice a little bit of vibration if you're fully poly mounts and you have everything kind of stiff as you should. I personally think you notice it as a passenger more than you do as the driver. But just take that into consideration. Simplify the problematic things. Balance shaft is one of those things. So really hope you guys enjoyed kind of a little bit of our rant style videos, not typically how we do things, but figured we make it a little bit more casual, and we're planning on doing some form of a live video in the near future. So if anyone has any questions or things like that, kind of give you guys the opportunity to chime in, just ask your questions. If there's any one particular question, it could be about anything, Saab, Porsche, Audi, doesn't matter what it is, just chime in, ask anything. It can be anything.
Maybe we
just
should
about
do like
cars.
Free help Fridays.
Yeah, something. So we'll figure something out that makes sense, but we really hope you guys kind of enjoyed this, kind of our botched motor here. Everything you saw in the video today is pretty much going in the trash. So don't take anything, take it with a grain of salt.
Who wants to
the
buy
way that we've been taking it apart, putting it in and out, it's all
flipping
components
it around,
that
throwing
are
it around.
trashed. And I mean, hell, even just Ryan,
he's done like
probably
16 to
20 motors now,
18
H-Series motors, plus some others. And then
modes,
so in shop, we're well approaching the
200.
200 H-Series motor builds at this point. So we've got a lot of really cool data to share with everybody in the community, kind of what fails, what doesn't fail, kind of what kind of power goals you can get. So we're only hoping to, how should we say, widen the horizon on the possibility of the H-Series motor. So once again, thank you guys for watching. And as always, like and subscribe.